Our conversation for this hour is with Dr. Kenneth Ombongi, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of History and Archeology at the University of Nairobi. He's been here before and had a really great conversation around what is happening in DRC. But that brings us to a place whereby since then there have been developments in the region, and in terms of what that portends for the region are some of those conversations that we will have this morning. But Dr. Ombongi, we want to say thank you very much for coming to the Situation Room again. Good morning.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
On a rainy day.
It's a pleasure to be back here and realize that you guys are still spicing it up. There's showers of blessings, both literally and also in a sense spiritually. We're keeping on.
That's awesome.
We wish our Muslim brothers and sisters blessings of Eid. And we say Eid Mubarak.
Indeed. Yeah. Asante so much for doing that and also for being here this morning. And we're going to talk about a number of things today. Important for us we don't live in an oyster. And in this case, when you say the world is your oyster, in this case, really it is. And the region is your oyster, even though Kenya is. So the world is not Kenya and Kenya is not the world. And we live in an ecosystem. And unfortunately, that ecosystem is wrought with conflict every now and then. To understand the DNA of that conflict in order to understand how to be able to help, I think is extremely important. And that forms the basis of some of the conversations that we will have today. But before we do that, CT, as you know, has gone through the same continent and come back from another country. He'll let you know what that is and what the proverb is for today, and then you can interpret that for us.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Well, there's an archipelago in the Indian Ocean, and it is called Comoros. Now, as I explained in the previous hour, a group of islands, an extensive group of islands, not just two islands, a group, extensive, is what forms an archipelago. We have one in Lamu. Okay? You're talking about Pate, you're talking about Siu, talking about Shela, and so forth.
Manda.
Bas. Yeah. Exactly. That's an archipelago. But this particular country has one serious distinction. Since its independence on the 6th of July, 1975, it has experienced 20 coups or coup attempts. 20.
Only.
So they're not the cup holders here. But they're good competitors for the cup. Okay? But it is a republic that is actually rich in history. Very, very rich in history. And it goes back to the years, like 870 AD. It's a long, long time ago. It has evolved over time. And the proverb from this particular country is very simple, straightforward, and easy to understand. If you live by the river, you should make friends with a crocodile.
Wow. If you live by the river,
yes,
you should make friends.
The crocodile. It helps.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That's a wonderful way of saying, you need to be aware of your environment. Where you live affects a number of things, including your own security. So if you live in a certain setting, then you need to be able to understand the dynamics of those settings for you to live well. Understand your neighbors, understand who matters in that area. So in other words, the proverb is really reminding us that there is need, to mend fences with the people you live with. Sometimes you are not able. You don't choose the people you live with. It's just geography that gives them to you. So
the good doctor is referring to relatives.
Of course.
You have to make do with them and live with them. So,
you don't have a choice.
It's really encouraging us to coexist with others.
Right.
And I wondered why CT had to go all the way to Comoros to get that, because
it's because the capital is Moroni,
Yes.
and he's from a place called Moroni. So he just saw, I'm at home.
because there are proverbs of similar meaning
Yes.
around our communities in Kenya.
Yes,
First, one from among my people comes very
To mind. Please tell us that
to
proverb.
mind. You know, it literally says, let me probably put it in that language. Last time I said here, and you didn't take me seriously, that I think in my mother's language, and then translate it to English, so you can imagine the linguistic gymnastics that go on in my head as I'm speaking here. It simply says, nse abande nkena magesabire okugambwe kukwaimuka. Which literally means if you live in other people's land, it is important to be aware of what happens around you, because not everybody could be friendly.
It is true.
So City, you didn't have to go to Comoros, but nevertheless, that speaks of the similarities among our people around the world.
It's true.
And the significance of such a sage knowledge. Professor, I remember Odero Ruka used to call it sage knowledge. Yes. Yes.
And even as you do, I think it's perfect in sense of what we're talking about today. That if you live amongst certain people, because let's look pre-1884.
Yes.
Pre-1884, it's believed that the peoples of this continent lived amongst each other. The divvying up, the division of the continent is what brought about the nations as we know them today. But it is very clear that we have people from similar communities who live across borders. Now, understanding and still being able to live with one another is still very important today. And I'm going to take that into the regional context that forms the basis of the conversation that we have today, whereby Kenya and where it is unfortunately, at one time or another, surrounded by conflict. Whether you want to look at South Sudan, whether you want to look at Sudan, whether you want to look at Uganda, whether you want to look at DRC, whether you want to look at Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the issues that happen around these areas. Now, when you were here last, we talked about the issues of DR Congo, which still are simmering, which are still there. We still have, statements or no statements. We've seen countries of the Gulf come in and try and broker mediation between Tshisekedi and Paul Kagame. Most recently, we've seen that the president of Kenya has then now called on Raila Odinga to go to South Sudan and broker some kind of an agreement then between Salva Kiir and Juan Marach. We've also seen that on the same Sudan issue, Kalonzo Musyoka, in the year when he was vice president, brokered some kind of peace in Sudan, brokered peace in South Sudan in 2011, in 2012, in 2020. That has been the sing-song for the longest time. What are the causes and why is it important as we look at the regional conflict? And if we can zero in on South Sudan, which is the latest issue that we deal with today in terms of news, has been happening, and why is it pivotal for Kenya to be in this position?
Thank you so much, Okoh, for that background. As I said last time, sometimes you sound like a good student of diplomatic history of the region.
She is.
I look forward to seeing you in my class in the university one of these fine days.
I'll take that quickly.
And doing a master's project or a PhD on that. It sounds very fascinating. Maybe before I go to the gist of what you have asked about why all these efforts from Kenya trying to make peace in the region, and what is really happening, or what is causing this. And what I wanted to mention is that We have always had this misconception that there were no territorial boundaries in Africa in prayer 1885, just the Berlin Conference, where Africa was shared as if they were sharing a melody among European countries. There were boundaries. There were territorial boundaries before European invention in Africa. The only difference between what predated colonialism and what we had after colonialism was established was that the African boundaries were not lines on a map and beacons on the ground. No. They were kind of contiguous areas whose significance, both historical and cultural, Africans understood. Historically, when we talk about the Kingdom of Buganda in the interlacustrine region, in the lake region of Africa, it is general boundaries were known. There could have no lines on the map marked categorically to indicate this. What colonialism brought that was different is this idea of fixated on a spot, a geographical spot, that this is it. Yes. And that one is distinct from this one. That is what was new, and the science of boundary making as part of colonial modernity is what came in. But before that, Africans had boundaries. Yes, it was generally known. For example, how much the Maasais dominated in present days Rift Valley, and you can see that even by the names of the towns. Yes. Majority of the names of the towns in Kenya, particularly in Kenya's Rift Valley, are actually of Maasai origin, including our own nation's capital, Nairobi, which is a Maasai word denoting, a place where the Maasais will retreat to when the earthy plains dried up. So they call it Inkarenyo Robi, which I'm told in Maasai means a place of cool waters. Yes. And you go Olkaria, Naivasha, all these are of Maasai origin. Nakuru. You can continue. Maasai from up in Lake Turkana to Lake Natron. That's why one historian has described the Maasais before colonialism as lords of the Rift Valley. That's Professor Richard Waller, the American historian who did some very fascinating work on the Maasai. So there were boundaries. So let's just abuse that notion. And when you do your project, please bear that in mind.
I will bear that in mind.
Yes.
There's also a misconception that Africans didn't have conflict among themselves.
Exactly.
And that Africans did not have slavery among themselves.
Yes.
We did.
Yes, we did. And there is a crop of these anti-colonial historians. We call them nationalist, overly nationalist historians, who want to make us believe that it was all bliss and all smooth all the way in pre-colonial Africa. No. We had conflict, we had violence, imperial exploits were there. In Kenya, read about the Wanga Kingdom in Western Kenya and how dominated the Bukushus and all the people of the area. The Buganda Kingdom that I mentioned, same thing. They were inter-community conflicts.
In fact, it's what made it possible.
Yes.
For the colonialists to infiltrate.
You needed a man on the ground, essentially.
Yes.
And they exploited these differences that perhaps were conflicts towards the end of imperialism and colonialism.
Yes. Yeah. So let's be real and disabuse those notions that have been created to suggest that pre-colonial Africa things were just bliss all the way, and we lived wonderful in a bountiful nature where you only needed to scratch the the ground and put a seed and it sprouted.
Something grows?
And no, it was more complex than that. Now, let me come directly to your question. Kenya is, it is... I remember very well, we were in university then, and the President Daniel Arap Moi will say, Kenya is an island of peace in a perilous sea of conflict. Well, you see, the main reason, both historically and contemporarily, why Kenya is interested in what is happening in the region, is partially because of the geopolitical and national interest of the country. Even literally, and I've said this before in one of the lectures that I gave to the staff and students of Florida University, that if you put your hand on your heart, okay, and you have the map of Africa on behind you, and you look away and you put your hand on your heart, Kenya is on the same spot where your heart is. Literally. Just figure it out cognitively.
Got it.
You see
Yes.
that. If the map of Africa was on this wall, and you faced away from it,
yes,
and you put your hand on your heart, actually that's where Kenya is.
Okay.
And that way there's a sense in which this country is actually the heart of Africa, if not Eastern Africa. And for a long time, you're talking about the strongest regional economy with relative political stability. We ever had our own chaos.
Sure.
True. But relatively, we have had a strong economy. In the 60s, Mwalimu Nyerere in Tanzania went east. And then impressed very strong African values and also used Kiswahili to unite Tanzanians. What he ended up creating in that socialist experiment is a strong state but a weak economy. Our legendary Mzee Kenyatta danced very comfortably to the West, impressed very strong capitalist tendencies mediated by state power and state structures, and created a very strong acquisitive middle class. The cumulative effect of that Kenyatta experiment was actually a strong economy but a weak state. So because of our strong economy, we had a lot of influence in the region. Geopolitically, within the East African region, Central Africa, we had a very strong influence. And that has contributed to a relative phobia that many countries in the region have, against Kenya. Our brothers and sisters from across the border in Tanzania, they are fond of saying Wakenya hawa.
Yes.
When Mwalimu Nyerere translated Merchants of Venice as mapepari wa Fenisi, to the Tanzanians, mapepari ni Wakenya. So because of that, we have had interest in the region, and it is to our advantage to make sure that the region is stable in order to support our economy. I hope I will not offend our brothers and sisters from Southern Sudan. Every time you go to Juba, every time I go to Lumbek, there is a sense in which South Sudan looks like the 48th county of Kenya. You see Kenya Commercial Bank, you see Omo from Nairobi, you see my own students. I ran Kenya Tali College for 9 years. My own students are the ones running hotels in Juba. In fact, I'm more at home in Juba than I could be, probably in some suburbs of Nairobi, because of this Kenyan presence. Many peace NGOs, many humanitarian organizations, chances are very high that the CEO and a few senior managers are Kenyans. So because of this, go to Rwanda. Even in Tanzania itself, the same thing. You go to the hotel industry, the tourism sector. The key players in terms of personnel are actually Kenyans. I was surprised many years back in the 90s. I went to the remotest parts of Tanzania, a place called Songea in some villages. I found some 2 Kenyans selling stationery on motorbikes. So because of that, it has always been to the interest of this country to make sure that there is peace and stability in generally the East African region. You know very well that I don't want to say this loudly.
You can whisper.
I can whisper. But, there is a way in which the minor resources of DRC easily finds their way into our nation's capital. At some point, we were touted to be a serious exporter of gold. I don't see it being mined in Makalda mines in Western and a few other places. Your guess is as good as mine as of our interest in the timber we use here. Tell me
where it comes from. So are you saying, Doc, that at some point that Kenya has been looked up to then be able to broker, and that is why we saw that whether it was in Somalia that Kenya was brokering?
What I'm saying, my sister Okoh, is that Kenya has played, in very plain language, big brother role in this region. It may be declining, and we seem to be not doing very well in this sense, but over the years, because of our strong economy, our very highly developed education system, which you may not see when you are inside, and many other things, we have played a big brother role. In fact, it was Professor Mazrui at some point who spoke about recolonization of Africa.
Right.
Where he delineated a new kind of colonization because of the levels of instability in different regions of Africa. He said he is not advocating for calling back the Europeans and to recolonize us. There is a way that a dominant power within a regional space will actually exert its influence in order to maintain peace and stability in this region. In East Africa, he actually identified Kenya, not because he was a Kenyan, but because he could see the ingredients that the countries exhibited, qualified it for strong economy, extended influence within the region. In Southern Africa, of course, the big brother, South Africa, was there. In Northern Africa, he talked about Egypt. In West Africa, he talked about Nigeria. I know that his peers strongly criticized him, but Mazrui based his argument on a very strong historical foundation of countries that have regional influence that dominated this region. And those notions extend up to today.
Right.
The tendency to see ourselves as a big brother, and as a big brother, literally, you have to make sure that your younger brothers are peaceful
and taking care. Kenneth Ombongi is our guest this hour. We're looking at what's happening because there always is one person or two or a group of people. When you go from Somalia to South Sudan to Uganda to Sudan itself and DR Congo, one would ask then, what is the impact of Kenya being and playing big brother in the region? What's the impact that we've seen so far?
If you look at, for example, in the last 3 decades, and the diplomatic developments in Eastern Africa, you will see the footprints of Kenya as a hegemonic power, if I may use that a little bit bombastic terminology. You know, I sometimes get influenced by the PLO spirit.
School of thought.
Yes. You know, Kenya's hegemonic influence in the region. And you have seen very clear peace initiatives championed by the country. Beginning from the Sudan that you mentioned, the origins and growth of now what you call South Sudan was basically a direct influence of Kenya's mediation process, starting during the era of President Arap Moi, who had a very strong interest in Southern Sudan, and then culminating in the signing of the CBA in 2005, I think that was, and the emergency of one of the newest states in the continent of Africa, South Sudan. You know, that did not stop there. Even when there seemed to be tensions between the Republic of Sudan and South Sudan, then that's when Kenya came in. Very, very handy. You very well narrated the story of the role that Kalonzo played. And then now when South Sudan has emerged as a country and is being plagued by the usual problems that plague African countries in the first 10 years of independence emerge. Kenya is still playing a role, you know, through IGAD. They dispatched the Right Honorable Prime Minister to go to South Sudan and see whether they can broker some peace. Historically, you know, it's not accidental that the former Prime Minister was more suited to go to South Sudan. The former Prime Minister is a Luo, and that is the homeland of the G-speaking people. So
we can make that parallel?
So those are his brothers,
That
in a
is
sense.
of that particular
historical.
group of mankind. Yes.
The Ba Erigazar region is actually the credo of the Luo-speaking people, who were distant cousins of the Dinkas and the Nwals, who are now a dominant force in South Sudan. So you couldn't have found a better person culturally and historically.
So he was not just giving him something to do.
It's more than that.
Okay.
You know, you look at the history and origins of Raila's people, then the South Sudanese are bound to identify themselves much more with him than they could do to poor Kenneth Ombongi here. So that aside, you know, the stature of the former Prime Minister actually is more or less like a former president, if you ask me. Raila has this very interesting contradiction of having been the longest serving president of Kenya without being president. You know, so because of that, he fitted the bill. If you asked me, I know some people will be of the view that the setback that the country suffered due to the just ended African Union and Commission elections could influence things otherwise, but I don't think whether the impact will be very strong. We are dealing with the same man whose stature is larger than life. You know, he has you know, the ability to attract both, you know, passion and hate in equal measure. And if you were thinking that it was only in Kenya, but now we are clear that it's actually something continental. Yeah, the presence of Raila attracts many people who love him. And also the presence of Raila attracts many people who hate him.
So the thing is here, Dr. Ombongi, that when you look at conflict and in its nature, usually, I mean, a lot of the conflicts that we've had on this side of the pond have been resource-based conflicts. There have been power-based conflicts in terms of who's going to rule, because once you rule with power, you have control over the resources. It's a no-brainer.
Yes.
And these are really hard-line positions that two sides of any conflict have taken. So the question is, if I've taken such a hard stance on a position I hold, whether it is control of resources like we've seen in most of the conflicts, or control of power, why would a mediator from another country who may have an understanding of where we're from, could even be brothers, then be able to come in? What is it that they would be able to do? I mean, we can look at the art of mediation and what it's able to achieve, but why would I relinquish my position because someone from another country who you would very well say has no connection to us, apart from the brotherhood thing, of course? Why would I listen to that person?
One clear reality that we have had in the history of the Eastern African region, or even in the African continent, is that political disagreements, whether they are based on ethnic differences or struggle over power and the resources, if they are not managed very carefully, they can actually not just split the country, but end it. The example of the situation in Somalia, though Somalia is now struggling out of that prolonged and protracted conflict situation, is a classic example to go by. So a leader from outside, the example of the Right Honourable Prime Minister that we have talked about, will actually bring in another dimension, probably that the protagonists in South Sudan's case are not seeing. And having the kind of relationship, which is cultural and historical, as I talked about, probably will make the two, Majar and Keel, who are brothers from different communities that dominate the politics of South Sudan, to look at the country much more differently than they have done hitherto. I want to believe that the great country of South Sudan is bigger than the two men fighting for power. The Nuer and the Dinka, those dignified, tall, elegant Africans, need peace and stability. And from history, we have seen that the first decade of any country in Africa will determine the direction it will take in the future. If you look at in the 1960s, the countries that enjoyed some relative stability in the first decade of independence, they remained stable, relatively stable even up to today. Those ones that did not, they have actually remained a bit violent and unstable up to today. It seems to me that Sudan has started from, the former case of experiencing chaos. So the earlier they are made to realize that it is to the advantage of their country to maintain some level of peace and stability, to accommodate diverse interests, the better. And an outsider who has no direct interests on what is happening in South Sudan can bring the two brothers on the table and tell them that the country of Sudan is bigger than all your personal interests. You can coexist. You can also share.
Dr. I have to ask, every time we talk of conflict in this region, talking about from the Red Sea coming down this way, there's always been talk about external influence, input. External interest is how what it is referred to.
You see, Andrew said this when I came in. As a continent, we are not an island. And as a region, we have a long history of external intervention. Actually, if you extended it further, we are a product of these external interventions. What you call the post-colonial countries of Africa are a product of European imperial designs, which was an external invention. That did not stop when power transited from Europeans to Africans in this continent. It continued. Don't forget, CT, that we are an extremely rich continent. We only happen to be poor. Partially because of this.
The people happen to be poor.
If you took the dichotomy of people and the environment, our environment is very rich.
Yes.
We are a bit poor,
Yes.
partially because of our responsibility and partially because of these interventions that you are
And the
talking
poverty
about.
goes up to our leaders as well.
Yes.
They're equally poor.
Our leaders are equally poor, especially if you talk about poverty of the mind. There is again, I go back to my village. There is a singer who sang a few years ago that you better have material poverty, that you go without clothes, instead of having poverty of
the mind. The mind.
Who was this artist?
The artist is now late. It's called John Ariso. It's one of these Benga musicians.
The Benga genre. Yes.
You better have poverty of clothes other than having poverty of the mind. That's literally what he was saying. And our leaders have really suffered in that. If there are classic cases in the history of Africa that demonstrate that a resolute leader who has decided to put his country and his people first will make a difference. Mutala Mohammed in Nigeria. The legendary General Ajebe has actually documented this in his book, The Trouble with Nigeria. The guy was around for hardly 3 years.
But
he made a big difference. My idol, Tom Sankara. You know that? He changed his country in 3 years from country running around Europe with a begging bowl into a self-sufficient country in a number of aspects. And much more recently, the Mirzali junta in Traore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Doing the same thing in the same country.
He's doing the same thing. It's the same country and same continent where others have struggled.
In fact, let's throw in Jerry Rawlings into it.
Yes. Throw Jerry Rawlings into the mix.
Yes.
And you see young, resolute, without having the baggage of history, and saying, guys, we will make a change, we'll transform our society.
Whether we like it or we like it.
We will dignify the lives of our people. Whether whoever is an international community likes it or not, we will still continue.
So what we're saying essentially here, when we look at the conflicts, where we're still doing this rudimentary conflict over resources, whereby you can actually have resolute leaders who stand up and say, you know what, enough is enough. We can actually make a situation where the people of the country are, number one, they're protected, they're provided for, and a conducive environment through which they can thrive.
Exactly. Even some of the leaders who have died with the ignominy of mismanagement, when they started, they were great people. I remember when we were young, small boys, young men who did very well and looked like they had a future. We nicknamed them Mugabe, Comrade Gabriel Robert Mugabe, because the guy was doing very well in Zimbabwe. When Zimbabwe gained independence, from the British, and he renames the country after the great Zimbabwe, one of the ancient civilizations of that region. And Comrade Robert Gabriel Mugabe looked like he knew where he was taking that country.
And I want to bring another individual into this, which a lot of times is wrought with, Muammar Gaddafi.
You can say that again.
When he led Libya, the people of Libya went to school for free until they were 18. The people of Libya had social health care. They had medical treatment. They had a crude oil for which it benefited the people of the nation before anybody else.
They had affordable housing.
And to add a bit of comic to that, he could even went to the extent of paying dowry for the young man.
There you go.
I wish he came to my village when I was growing.
And then they killed him, and I use those words very clearly on what I'm saying.
Yes.
And then they killed him, and then Libya has gone into a place where it hasn't been for the last 60 years.
That's it. You see, that's why as an undergraduate student in the 90s in the University of Nairobi, we would read the Green Book of Muhammad Gaddafi under our blankets because it was a banned one. So we would cover ourselves strongly. I remember I used to keep my copy somewhere in a bathroom in Hall 3 in main campus, University of Nairobi, where I lived. And Muhammad Gaddafi was our idol. At the time. I've said something about Robert Mugabe. We will nickname people who look like they had a potential in their future of doing well. We'll nickname Comrade Robert Mugabe. If they were not looking very well and they were brutal, we would nickname them Amin. And I mean, you could understand this.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to slight our brothers in Uganda, but that was the situation as small boys growing up in the 80s in the highlands. But that told you something, that still Africa has a chance. All hope is not lost. We have these historical examples that we remind ourselves of Tom Sankara, of Murtala Muhammad. Now you've talked about Muhammad Gaddafi and Robert Mugabe when he started. That it can be done. We can transform our societies. We can dignify our lives. We can graduate from being a continent of poverty, hunger, and disease,
conflict.
So there is that hope. So I'm looking forward to a time when in our capitals in Eastern Africa, from Juba to Nairobi, from Nairobi to Kampala, from Kampala to Dodoma stroke, Dar es Salaam, that hope will emanate from these areas. For that to happen, then we need transformative leadership that will put self-interest, away and put the interests of the nation, interests of the region, and the interests of the continent first. It can be done.
It can be done.
We tend to forget what the young man who took the leadership of Senegal and decided to sever links with some of the international, actors who have stifled the growth of Africa for very long. Things are looking up also. I hope they will be able to sustain this, because there's another side of our history which demonstrates a very interesting paradox. We liberate ourselves from one imperial dominator
and take on another
one. And things look good for 5 years, and then they go south.
Is it possible? And if we see from the likes of Burkina Faso today with Traore, and then look at Senegal, for example, and we even look at to some extent Rwanda and what is being done, whereby you will be insular about your development and almost to some extent turn a blind eye or turn your back to what would be international interference. Does that look like parts of a recipe for success?
Yes, it does. From where I sit this morning, I think it does. Again, as a historian, I'm recognizant of the fact that the reason why that didn't work previously is because Africa is still a disunited continent. Because the shining examples that we are naming now, from Rwanda to what Traore is doing, and Senegal and many others, are not the very first ones.
No.
But you see, these are tiny pockets of what Africa is. Africa is a country with now...
Continent.
Is a continent with now 54 countries, with over, I think, 1.3 billion people. Uniting and turning into a shining example, a tiny little country of 50 million people like Kenya is a drop in the ocean, if you ask me literally. What we need is to have a very strong sense of Pan-Africanism.
Sure.
And build a notion of what we lately call in scholarship Global Africa. the idea that an African, wherever and whenever you find him, is actually an African. The Indians have done that very well. And partially that's why they seem to be developing by leaps and bounds. According to the Indian statutes, any Indian anywhere in the world is Indian, whether he has been there or not. You see, I've stayed in India. I know India more than some of the Indians, Kenyan Indians here. But they are Indian, I'm not. You get that? And they are allowed to do certain things in India, whether you have been there or not. For as long as you are an Indian. You are Indian. They are called non-resident Indians. I think we need to begin to embrace that. You know, I shudder to think about this situation. The last time I traveled to Lubumbashi, it took me longer to get to the Democratic Republic of Congo, than to get to London.
Why?
Because you have to connect through Ethiopia, Gabon, and
you don't go direct.
You don't go direct.
Oh,
yes. In Africa. What is that? It takes shorter to get to Europe than
to go to Lubumbashi.
And it's even cheaper.
So those are some of the things that we need to talk about.
Yeah.
So these shining little examples of Senegal, Nigeria, Musa Traore and the rest can only make meaning if we started actually looking more African in terms of our continent than we have done before. Because you see, some African countries will be used to undermine
others.
And that has happened historically. The Cold War, the West-East conflict, did more damage to Africa than any other continent, fighting other people's wars on our soil. We talk about and I realize fellow historians are culprits in this. They talk about the First and Second World Wars. Were they really world wars or European wars fought in many fronts?
Other parts of the world.
So for me, the secret of success in Africa is in the development of a strong sense and spirit of Pan-Africanism, the oneness of Africa, global Africa. You go. I did my PhD from Cambridge in the UK, and I could see the differences between us and British, so-called British Africans. They hate us, we hate them. Then every time we meet, as those of us from Africa, we wonder why there are many more British Africans in prison than there are in colleges and universities.
And those are the thoughts.
And we start looking down upon them. We hang around with our European friends, and look at that.
Yeah.
Look at the same thing applies to them. They wonder these idiots coming here, running away.
Who just climbed down?
How do they think?
The other day.
Yeah, and I mean these, and I think those are the conversations that we had. We have to have them. We do ourselves an injustice if we don't, because we always say two things happen when you have a conversation.
Yes.
One, you keep talking about it and keep it front, or something is done about it. So I want to really thank you.
We need to change this narrative of Africa making 2 steps forward and making 3 steps backward.
Indeed.
Honestly, we have to.
Dr. Kenneth Ombongi has been our guest this hour, senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi in history and archaeology.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.